preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The topic of this lecture is the psychological roots of war and destructiveness. And I feel I ought to make some comment about this title in order to avoid a number of misunderstandings. Somebody could think that the title implies the idea that the causes for war are essentially of a psychological nature. And many people have said in the past and today that men are so full of destructiveness that therefore wars are the result of this psychic disposition of theirs. I do not believe this. I do not believe that the essential causes of war are of a psychological nature, or that war can be explained psychologically. I think the essential causes of war are of a political, economic, and social nature, and are to be found in the structure of the world, in the political and social structure of the world. In fact, while there are some murderers in the world, as we all know, they are relatively rare, and I would almost say astonishingly rare, considering the views we hear sometimes about the deep destructiveness of man which leads to war. Most of the soldiers who kill in war would never kill a single human being. And they kill not because of their destructiveness. I want to quote here a very interesting article which just has been published in the magazine Judaism, published by the American Jewish Congress, by an Orthodox rabbi, Tamaret, who died in 1931, and who wrote about war and peace and nationalism. And he gives there a very interesting interpretation of a famous sentence by the prophet Isaiah, where he says that nation shall not raise its sword against nation. And Rabbi Tamaret says, indeed, only a nation can raise its swords against the nation. Only when people are organized in nations, and therefore each individual member uses his full humanity in his approach to members, to human beings belonging to another nation, only then are they capable of raising a sword against other people. If they would act not as members of nations, not as people who recognize that the law of the nation is a supreme law, then if they would not act in that way, then indeed very few people would raise their sword or whatever it is against another human being. But nevertheless, saying that wars are not caused by hostility, destructiveness, aggressiveness of man, does not mean that the problem of aggressiveness and hostility is immaterial or negligible. Because while I assume that wars are not caused by it, wars would not be possible unless men were ready to fight, just as war would not be possible if there were no weapons. There is obviously some human material, some human substance, some human tendencies, which make it possible for wars to occur. It is not necessarily so that this human tendency which makes war possible is primarily hostility. We shall discuss that a little later. It may just be the sheep-like nature of men to follow their leaders and to believe any nonsense they are told. But nevertheless, it is also undoubtedly a phenomenon which is relevant to the possibility of war, this phenomenon of aggressive and destructiveness, and therefore I think it is important in a time which is threatened more by a more terrible destructiveness than the human race has been ever confronted before, to consider the problem, what is human hostility? What is human destructiveness? Is it true what Hobbes said and what some theologians say today in different words, that homo homini lupus, that one man acts and feels like a wolf to another man. We might then raise the question in Hobbesian terms, is man sheep or is man wolf? Indeed, much is to be said for the idea that man is sheep. He is easily influenced, easily follows their leaders, believes any kind of nonsense provided it is told to him either harshly or with a sweet tongue of persuasiveness. And those who have a conviction of their own are rare and always have been rare. Indeed, a book which was read by many, The Nation of Sheep, makes it very clear that today, in spite, or maybe because of the education which everybody enjoys, we behave like sheep. And then, indeed, we might say Hobbes was quite wrong. Man is not at all a wolf. He is a sheep who follows. But then a good case can also be made for the idea that man is not a sheep at all, but is a wolf. Because why is it, after all, that man's history is so different from the history of sheep? At least, I'm not speaking now scientifically about sheep. I'm speaking symbolically, if you please, the way sheep impress us in their daily lives when we see them. The history of man is a history written in blood. It's a history of force and violence. It's a history of ruthless exploitation of those who cannot kill by those who have the power to kill. All that does not look like a sheep-like existence. And yet the arguments on both sides, whether man is sheep or whether man is wolf, leave one puzzled. It is true, we all have seen truly destructive persons. We know them, we have experienced them, and we have seen if one or group of truly destructive persons gains the power in a state or in a nation, that then he may have the will and the capacity of killing millions and millions of people. But then are the true killers the ones whom we see in our daily lives? Are our neighbors, are most of them killers? I don't think so. I don't think that's our experience. Should we say perhaps then that most of our neighbors are just wolves in sheep's clothing, that they repress their true nature of wanting to kill and to destroy, and only when they have an opportunity, like in war, their true nature breaks out and then they become the real killers? Well, that is possible. And yet even that is not entirely convincing, because we find so many people who, while they would not sacrifice their lives in order not to kill, nevertheless are abhorred and repelled by acts of senseless killing and brutality. Of course, a psychoanalyst might say that just proves the point. They are abhorred because they like it. But with this kind of logic, one can prove almost anything. And unless one has very good evidence, indeed, I think this is an explanation which is not legitimate. Or should we assume then there are really two races, the wolves and the sheep among men, and that the sheep act like wolves simply because they are sheep, namely because they follow. And when the wolves are in power, and when the wolves shout loud, then the sheep follow and act as if they were wolves. That's possible too. But at any rate, it remains a puzzling question, and in fact it has been a puzzling question for several thousand years in the Western civilization. It has been, in fact, one of the most fundamental questions in the history of Western philosophy, and especially theology. Namely, the basic question, is man good or evil? And by evil, one would understand, is he corrupt if we speak theologically? Is he destructive if we speak psychologically? Let me only mention briefly the history of this problem in theological thinking. Essentially, in the Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament, in the later Jewish tradition, man is not conceived as being evil. Man is not presumed to be corrupt. In fact, his first act of disobedience, which in Christian thinking has given rise to the idea that man is corrupt, in Jewish philosophy of history is, in a sense, the first act of freedom. It is the beginning of human history, and man redeems himself in the process of history. Or rather, I shouldn't say he redeems himself, he can redeem himself. Because according to Jewish thought, man has always the choice. As it is once put in the Bible, I put before you today blessing and curse, life and death. You choose life. Man has both possibility, and in the historical process, he can give birth to himself or he can destroy himself. It remains his choice, although this choice is determined by many factors. And it is especially determined by one factor which we see so clearly in the history of the liberation from Egypt. There the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, obviously, it would be rather incongruent with any picture we find in the Bible of God that he maliciously hardened the heart of the man whom he wanted to liberate the Jews, the Hebrews. Obviously, what this sentence means is that God did not interfere with the natural process. And the natural process is that our heart hardens with every evil deed we do. And it hardens to a point of no return if we continue. And our heart softens, but that is an unpopular term these days among many people who otherwise think they are good Christians, or Jews for that matter, by any good thing we do, by any loving act we do. And we are indeed increasingly determined by the very acts we commit. And when our heart is hardened completely, then indeed it will not change anymore. This is biblical philosophy, and I think it is also a very true picture of what happens in man, what happens in all of us. Now, in the Christian tradition, the concept of the evilness of man was first one of two opposite views. One concept was, and that was the Augustinian concept, which eventually won out in Christian theology, that man has been corrupted by Adam's sin. Adam's sin not only touched him, but all future generations, and that man can be saved from this intrinsic corruption only by the act of grace, by an act of grace by God. But there was, before this view became generally accepted, the view of Pelagius, who said that man is not corrupt, that he is corrupt only by bad example, that Adam's sin corrupted only him and not the future generations. Or, to quote a sentence of his, if I ought, I can, and I am not determined by Adam's sin, by something which happened to a given person. Pelagius, and more radically Celestius, continued really the older Jewish tradition, but they were defeated in Catholic thought, which accepted the idea of original sin, which is one of the main differences really, or became one of the main differences between traditional Jewish and Catholic thinking. But the viewpoint of the prophets, the viewpoint of Pelagius, had a renaissance, and it had this renaissance in the Renaissance, that is to say, in Renaissance humanist thinking. From the 15th and 16th century on in Europe, there is a new vision of man, the vision of man as, first of all, a man of dignity, a man with a potentiality of goodness, And there is a new idea, namely that of history, which becomes like in the Old Testament, the dimension in which God reveals himself and in which man becomes fully human. From Renaissance thinking on until the 19th century, we find the idea that history is a dimension in which man gives birth to himself, and he can give birth to himself because he is not basically corrupt. Cassirer has pointed to the fact that the Renaissance humanists, of course, could not challenge directly and overtly the Augustinian dogma of the corruption of man, and could not openly be adherents of Pelagius. But he points out that they undermined the Augustinian theory, and in reality, or let us say virtually, they steered close to Pelagius thinking. But then when the church lost power in the, or relatively so, in the 17th century, the 18th and 19th century, then indeed it was one of the essential points of modern thought to overcome the thought of the inherent corruption of man and to claim that man can be God. Of course, nobody, well, maybe not nobody, but most people were not so dumb and naive to claim that man is God. This is something which the evidence shows us all the time is not true. But the problem is not whether man is God, whether man can be God, whether man has a potentiality to develop himself to a point where he is God, which means where he loves life rather than destruction, where he prefers to construct, to build, to unite, rather than to destroy. But perhaps I could mention here one or two of the great thinkers of the Renaissance, which are very characteristic for this spirit I was talking about. For instance, Manetti wrote in a book, De Dignitate Excellentia Hominis, on the dignity and excellence of man. He wrote there that man is free, great, and dignified. While in contrast to him, Pope Innocent III, the representative of medieval papal absolutism, wrote a book with the title De Miseriae Humanae Vitae, on the misery of human life, which proclaims exactly the opposite. Man is dirt, he is weak and unstable, and hence he must be directed by strong authorities. Or let me remind you of a philosopher with whom more of you will be acquainted, with Pico della Mirandola, who in his speech on the dignity of man wrote, "Neither heavenly nor earthly, neither mortal nor immortal have we created thee, so that thou mightest be free according to thy own will and honor, to be thy own creator and builder. To thee alone we gave growth and development, depending on thy own free will. Thou bearest in thee the germs of a universal life." This idea then you find developed from Pico della Mirandola to Leibniz, Spinoza, Herder, Goethe, Marx, in the whole humanistic tradition from the 15th, 16th century on, and in men like Schweitzer or Einstein or Russell, the great humanists of our day. You find the same tradition, the same philosophy. But it is not the purpose of these lectures to talk about the philosophical problem, but I want to talk more empirically about what is human hostility, what is human destructiveness. And I think the main point here is that we refrain from making generalizations, that we talk about hostility in general, about evil in general, about corruption in general, but rather that we try to differentiate between various phenomena which are quite different and which unfortunately are too often confused with each other. And this is really the main topic of these lectures. I want to speak about several types and kinds of hostility and destructiveness as I see it, I do not claim that this is necessarily a complete enumeration or classification. It is the one which seems to me the most, touches upon the most important categories of hostility and destructiveness. I want to talk in these lectures about 5, if you don't mind. It seems kind of funny to talk about 5, might be 7 or 9 or 3, but I arrived at 5 different types of hostility. The first one, or aggression. The first one I would call playful aggression, by which I mean, I shall explain later what I mean in every category. Aggression, which is not really aggression, but which is a display of skill, and in this sense has a playful character. Secondly, reactive aggression, an aggression which is a reaction to threats to life and freedom, my own, that of others, and so on. Third, what I would call compensatory hostility, which is an aggression which is not anymore in the service of life, but which compensates for the failure to be fully alive, which compensates for the phenomenon of impotence. And impotence I don't mean here in the sexual sense, but in the much more important general sense of human impotence. The fourth type of aggression, which I shall talk about, is what I have called necrophilias aggression. I shall have to do a lot of explaining about this concept, and I shall try to do so. Right here I'll only say, I mean by that the kind of aggression which is rooted in the one perversion, in the one true perversion that exists in life, and that is the love of death. And eventually I shall talk about the fifth type of aggression, which I've called a narcissistic aggression, by which I mean the type of destructiveness which occurs as a reaction to the wounding of a person's narcissism, provided this narcissism is rather intense. Now again, I shall have to explain, and I shall try to later in these lectures, what is meant by narcissism and why the wounding of narcissism creates so much aggression, and why this narcissism is not just an individual phenomenon, it would be innocent then, but why narcissism is the root of one of the most dangerous phenomena which we observe in life, and that is of nationalism. Now let me talk about each of these categories of aggressiveness or of aggression, one after the other. There is not too much I have to say about what I called playful aggression. Aggression as display of skill and virility. You find it in many primitive tribes. You find it in the not that primitive groups of students, especially in Germany, who try to hit each other, not out of hostility, but to have the mark of bravery in their face for the rest of their lives, but certainly not because they hate each other. You have it in a highly developed form, let us say in a phenomenon like the art of swordsmanship in Zen Buddhism. Their swordsmanship is one of the highest skills, just like the performance of the tea ceremony is one of the highest skills. I remember a discussion we once had with Dr. Suzuki, where we kind of critically asked him that after all, how did sword fighting go together with the general Buddhist philosophy of compassion and lack of violence? And Dr. Suzuki said, well, really, there is no violence, no aggression in Zen Buddhist sword fighting. It just happens that the opponent who is killed was in the wrong place. In other words, the idea is that if both partners were equally skilled, nobody would ever be killed. It is not, according to the theory, a matter of wanting to kill anybody, but of displaying such skill that if the opponent is not skilled enough, by accident, he will be killed, but not by my intention. Well, of course, this is a very fine line, But then very few of us know what a master of anything feels, whether he is a master of the tea ceremony or master of swordsmanship or a master of living for that matter. So I'm mentioning this only because here you find in a highly sophisticated form the idea that an act which sounds like real aggression, sword fighting, which could lead and often does lead to the death of a man, actually supposed to be completely unaggressive because it is nothing but the display of skill, and the result of this, the death of a man, is entirely incidental. You find incidentally the same thing in children. You find a good deal of aggressiveness in children, which is self-affirmation, which is display of skill, and naturally you might find that for many people, especially if they have good coordination and many other physical qualities, display of skill in the sphere of fighting is perhaps one of the few areas in which they can display skill, and hence they are eager to do it there. Now, of course, this is actually, this aggression, playful aggression, or aggression as gamesmanship, is to be found in many places, but it is not really a great social problem, has probably not too much to do with war, although I would say it is not entirely to be separated from the phenomenon of war either. When the mass psychosis seizes upon a nation, then indeed a nation may be as proud of its better swords or cannon or atom bombs as a little boy is about the big stick he has found, except this has indeed nothing to do with the mastery with which the Zen swordsman, which the Zen master in swordsmanship displays his instrument. The second type of aggression, the one which I called reactive aggression, is one which is much more frequent and perhaps one of the most significant causes of war, or conditions of war, I should rather say, inasmuch as human motivation is concerned. Here we find aggression as a reaction to a threat to one's life, dignity, freedom, property, to one's own life, to that of one's family, of one's neighbor, of one's nation. Only very few people feel that aggression when the life of the human race is at stake. It seems then people are more peaceful than they are when their own life is at stake. Now, it is indeed a question which is debatable, whether it is permissible to kill somebody to save my life or my family's life or my nation's life. As you all know, the pacifists believe even then it is not permissible. Even then, killing is an act which cannot be tolerated. There may be others who say it is permissible perhaps, but it remains evil. But at any rate, whatever one's view is on the merits of killing in order to save life, there can be no doubt that aggression, which is a reaction to attack, and the aim of which is saving life, is something in the service of life and not in the service of death. That it is different from those acts of aggression which I shall speak now. However, before I come to the other types of aggression, I must mention one thing which is rather self-evident, and that is that wars are usually fought because people are made to believe that they are defending their lives or their freedom or their dignity or their property or the lives of their families and their fellow men. In the last 100 years, there was, I don't think, any war except wars against very, very small nations like Ethiopia, where it wasn't necessary to find a rationalization or a good motive. There were very few wars which were not conducted on both sides with the reasoning that this war was in defense of freedom. The First World War, which was a war of the most senseless killing of people, was presented to all nations as a war to save freedom and to save peace. And it was just fortunate for the governments concerned that on the one hand were the Russians and on the other hand was the German emperor. Because of that, the Germans could believe they were fighting for freedom because they were fighting the Tsar, and the French could believe that they were fighting for freedom because they were fighting the Kaiser. It is a matter of which is difficult to decide who was better and who was worse, but as the Treaty of Versailles showed, neither one was fighting for freedom, but was fighting to gain certain territories which they had promised each other before or when the war had started. The fact that most governments feel obliged to tell their people that they are fighting for their freedom shows obviously that you just don't get people to kill and to go into war unless this motivation is made plausible to them, unless they are instilled with a feeling that they are attacked. In other words, it is important to see that while indeed a person can be aroused to fight and to kill in order to save his life or the life of others, as far as war is concerned, the threat is usually manufactured. But since governments cooperate in this manufactured threat, the manufactured threat becomes a real threat, because once the war starts, or once it is about to begin, then indeed the lives of both sides are threatened. Now, this aggression in the defense of life is a very natural human phenomenon. It might not be the highest form of moral or spiritual behavior, but certainly it's not the lowest either. But it is also the most dangerous thing because governments indeed have the possibility of presenting the situation in such a way that this relatively innocent form of hostility is aroused and then becomes one of the least innocent and most dangerous sources for the possibility of war. Now let me speak about the next form of aggression, which leads us into that form of hostility which is not in the service of life anymore, which is rather, I would say, a symptom of the failure of life. And by that I'm referring to what I call compensatory aggression. Perhaps in order to explain this term and the concept I'm talking about here, I should begin to say that something rather general. Each man has a wish to achieve something, to leave his mark, as it were, in the world around him, in his life, to reach an aim, to influence others, to produce something, to create something which is his own individual creation. This may be in its most natural and fundamental form in the level of sex. It may be in the intellectual level, in the artistic level, in any kind of production, in the wish to move and to influence a person whom I love or a person whom I talk to and with whom I am together, or in the most common form perhaps, at least to influence my own children in some way. As we say, to educate them, to teach them something, to help them develop into good people. At least that's what most of us want. But to do this, to fulfill this aim of influencing, moving, touching another person, to fulfill this aim, one has to use one's own powers. One has to be productive in some fashion. If I may quote a sentence of Marx here, if you want to be interesting, you must be interested. If you want to be loved, you must love. You must make use, to speak in my own words, you must make use of your own human powers, your artistic powers, intellectual powers, emotional powers. You must use your own powers to move anything. You must give an example if you want to influence somebody. But here comes the important phenomenon that while we all want to create something, many of us are impotent. Now, sexual impotence is relatively rare. Relatively speaking, you can go to a doctor and that might help. And it's actually a trick of nature, probably, and biologically very understandable that so few people are sexually impotent because that would be a real danger to the survival of the human race. But impotence in a more general human sense is very, very frequent indeed. In its most pathological forms, it is what we in psychopathology would find as a complete detachment in a schizoid sense, or depression, or a sense of emptiness. In less pathological forms, it is that which we find in so many of us, namely those hidden forms of impotence in which life doesn't make sense, in which one has no hope, in which one has no aim, in which one has no vision. One lives as a brave and courageous man or woman because it is embarrassing and shameful not to live. But one really lives without the sense of potency, without the sense that one changes something. Now, you will find that in people and in every one of us, that when we are particularly interested in something, in an aim, let us say that our children behave in a certain way, or that our wives behave in a certain way, or that our friends do this, that, and the other, or that the telephone operator gives us a connection quickly, that if we are not able to achieve this aim, that something wells up, and that is rage. That is a wish to force it. That is an attempt to use violence when we cannot achieve an aim by the productive use of our powers or by our example. And you will find, I'm sure, with the exception of a few saints who are here tonight, that all of us experience more or less a sense of rage, a sense of using force, when what one usually calls we are frustrated, by which one usually means if we don't attain what we want. But really, this is an oversimplification of the phenomenon. It's not really being frustrated. It is a sense of impotence which makes us angry, which makes us wish to use force. People have become very sensitized, I'm afraid, by psychoanalysis and by many other devices of being so concerned with the danger of frustration. So it's terrible that little Johnny doesn't get what he wants, because if he's frustrated, then he will become neurotic as his parents are, and so on and so on. But actually, the problem is not at all frustration. The problem is impotence. The problem is a sense that I do not have the powers, the patience, and the concentration to achieve something with my own powers which I want to achieve. And this sense of impotence, of human impotence, is a phenomenon which creates the wish to use force. It is the psychology sometimes you find in crippled people, and you find then crippled people who don't have it at all. I shall talk a little later about this. And it's not always the impulse to use force. Force has many aspects. It's not necessarily physical force. It's political force. It's economic force. It is the force of persuasion. It is everything by which, instead of being interesting and stimulating in one form or another, You use force in order to make somebody do what you want. Actually, I would say that the lust for force, for using force, as a reaction to the sense of impotence, is perhaps the most widespread source of human aggressiveness. It is one which everybody can observe in himself, everybody can see in others. It is almost as if force were the universal coin of impotence. That the impotent person who cannot make use of his proper forces productively is prone to do the one thing, to use the one thing which requires nothing but to have a pistol, to have a rifle, to have power, to have money. If you have that, you can be as weak and as dumb as anybody on the earth, and yet you have something which is as powerful in its result as the tremendous achievement of changing something by human productivity, by human example, by human love, skill, reason. Of course, most people don't have the guns and they don't have the power. So they become tyrants toward those who still have less power than they. They are mostly children, and in some cultures, their wives, and in some cultures, the husbands. But I think if you study and examine the problem of the passion for force, and if I may quote Simone Weil here, that is the capacity of transforming a living being into a corpse. That's what force is. If you examine this phenomenon as a general human phenomenon, then indeed you will find that it is the symptom of human impotence, that violence, you might say, is a counterfeit of creation, that it is rooted in a mood of despair which makes a person incapable of standing any longer the awareness of incapacity to produce, to change, to create in any form which is rooted in himself and in his own productiveness. I might mention something here in addition to what I just said, and that is that for all of us, it seems to be very difficult to accept the position of the pure creature, that is to say, of a thing which has been created or born without his will and without being asked, and usually even dies without being asked, and most of the time even against his will. We want to transcend life, to transcend rather not life, but the situation of, let us say, the creature which feels like dice thrown out of a cup. And we can transcend this situation in two ways. Either by creating, there we must make use of our powers. By creating life, we transcend the passive situation of the creature. In the act of creation, we become, if you want to speak in theological language, we become gods. But as I said before, to create is not so simple. It requires a great deal of effort, of risk, and of concentration. But we also transcend life by destroying. To create life is a miracle, but to destroy life is a miracle too. Only it is a miracle which is very simple to perform. We transcend the role of creatures if we destroy life, because we become the masters of life by destroying. We are not subject to its laws anymore, just as we become the masters of life by creating. And I would say, in a wider sense, this aggressiveness and hostility, which I called compensatory hostility, is an attempt of man to master life when he feels incapable or impotent to create life. Incidentally, I should like to mention here that, or to make a footnote, I said in order to create life, or in order to create anything, we must make an effort, and we must be able to concentrate. I think that in our times, people tend to forget the importance of concentrating. It's a usual thing that somebody, as you all know, reads the paper and talks to his wife and listens to the radio and gives some good advice to his children, and he's at the same time thinking what he will do in business today. But that is not the only example. Almost everything is done with half concentration. People listen without listening. People talk without talking. That's why they misunderstand each other so often, and why conversation leaves people so disappointed, because nobody has been concentrated in listening and in talking. Now, it is a fact which everyone who observes these things will confirm, that you do not achieve anything without concentration. Nature has given us a lesson in this respect, because perhaps the most natural creation in the realm of nature, namely sexual relations between man and a woman, are not possible without concentration, without a certain amount of concentration at least. If people were as unconcentrated in their sexual affairs as they are in their life in general, I'm afraid the overpopulation problem would disappear. There we can learn from nature that actually even what is the most fundamental natural reaction, that of sexual potency, would not occur without concentration. But what holds true for that holds true for everything else, except the lesson isn't as clear. And and since everybody is equally not concentrated, everybody believes he is very concentrated, because we usually believe that if we are a good average, everything is fine. That's like in H.G. Wells' story of the land of the blind. If everybody is blind, he is healthy, and the person who sees is sick, and the doctors can describe the sickness very accurately, these peculiar protrusions in his face, which make claims which are obviously not only the result of a physical derangement, but also of a mental derangement, because he sees. I think it is very worthwhile to study objectively and in oneself this phenomenon of compensatory hostility, to watch oneself whenever this wave of rage, this tendency to force or using force and violence come up, and then to ask oneself, and the answer is then not so difficult, what is the experience of impotence I have at that very moment? I think that holds true for individuals, and it holds true for nations, for groups of people. And I believe that the question of combating aggressiveness and hostility, to its largest extent, needs to be discussed in terms of the question, how can human impotence be transformed into a sense of human potency? That indeed is or should be the aim of all education, of all learning, of all religion. But in fact, most of us are concerned in our society with problems of economic productivity rather than with that of human productivity, although we talk a great deal about these things and call it our tradition which we are to defend and so on. But actually the phenomenon of hostility in everyday life and in national life, I think, is to a large extent rooted in this very point of the phenomenon of impotence. Now, this type of impotence, this type of hostility, which I have talking about right now, the compensatory hostility, is still, as I said, not in the service of destruction. It is, in a sense, still a compensation for the failure of living. It expresses a disappointment with living, a frantic attempt to achieve that which one expects from life, namely as a human being, namely to create something, to make a dent on somebody, to move somebody. Next time, and in the third lecture, I shall talk about two types of hostility which are not anymore in the service of life, namely what I have called necrophilias aggression, aggression which is born out of a love for death and destruction and decay, and narcissistic aggression. These concepts will be a little bit more difficult, and I think next time I can use the lecture pretty much to talk about necrophilias aggression, and in the third lecture I shall deal with the type which I called narcissistic aggression. I'll stop here and we'll have an intermission of 10 minutes. I assume, if things are as they used to be, that you have cards and can write questions, that we will resume our discussion in about 10 minutes and then have about 20 minutes time for answering questions, provided there are enough questions. Thank you. Well, there are more questions than I could read, not to speak of answering them or discussing them. So I just have to take the ones I could read. One question is, can you reduce all 5 categories to one basic reason? Do they not overlap? Well, these are really two different questions, perhaps. I think, and I'll try to show, that qualitatively speaking, these 5 kinds of hostility are different and are not rooted in the same thing. But that doesn't mean that they do not overlap in one individual, as most psychological types or tendencies we speak of are not to be found purely in one individual and another one in another individual. Let us say the person who has no destructiveness whatsoever, no hostility and aggression whatsoever would be a saint, and the person who has nothing but destructiveness would be insane. There are some such people. But all of us are in between. The question that matters here, like in most psychological problems, is what is the respective weight of the blend? What is the respective weight of each of these tendencies? But in order to understand the problems, one has to be somewhat abstract in the sense that one speaks of separate tendencies, although in one given individual, these separate tendencies are blended with each other. Another question is, in what way do you feel that man can regain or revitalize his potency? Well, I would say, well, this is a very difficult question. My first thought that comes to my mind as an answer is by becoming interested in life. Now, that sounds perhaps banal and very simple, to become interested in life. The fact is that most people today, I think, are not interested in life. If you use the word interested in the sense which is somewhat different than from saying this was a very interesting book or very interesting party, almost everything today is interesting, fascinating, and some such thing. But if you rather think of the literal meaning of interest, which means interesse, to be in something, That means to be open to an idea, to a person, to nature, to whatever it is, to be in it and not to be within yourself. To be interested really means to leave yourself and to go out into the world and to be in the world. Well, if one is interested, then indeed life is very interesting. And if a person can become interested, then indeed he is not impotent in the sense in which I am speaking about it. So the question in a way could be reformulated by saying, what can one do to make life interesting? Well, I think here of something Spinoza once said, that a wise man contemplates life and not death. We contemplate death a good deal today, in fact, or the possibility of mass destruction, and otherwise we contemplate a great deal, not life, but things. All that serves consumption. Well, one may be interested in the steak one eats, one may be interested in the money one makes, one may be interested in the new sports car, but still that is slightly different from the way in which I use the word being interested, being in things. Now, a culture should serve the stimulation of interest. That's what education is for. That's what we in fact claim. And we even claim more. We say just because we have freedom, we can have an education which stimulates interest without being blinded to certain ideas. But I'm afraid that while it is true that we have freedom up to a certain point, we do not make too much use of it for the furthering of interest in life. Well, I could go on from here, but this would require another lecture, and I don't want to be endangered by this temptation. So I come to the next question, which says this: you speak of effort and concentration in connection with creation. Isn't it true that creation is not born in the moment of struggle? Isn't it born when one is open to all, shutting out nothing? Concentration implies shutting out disturbances by effort. Yet effort reveals conflict. In conflict, there is no freedom, no creation. Isn't effort and concentration then destructive to a still mind without which creation, touch with the real, is impossible? Please explain your use of these words. Well, I appreciate very much the thoughtfulness of this question, because indeed it touches upon one of the fundamental problems of living. I'm sorry, I shall not be able to answer it satisfactorily, because certainly the person who wrote this question has thought a good deal about the problem. Now, it seems to be the essential point here, the assumption that concentration requires effort, and effort is conflict, and therefore destructive. And I think this is not true. I think, and this has been said many times, especially by mystics, by mystical thinkers, concentration requires effort, and yet it does not require any effort. If you make an effort, you defeat your efforts. That is not just a play with words. What is meant by effort here really is the cramped holding on to things, the trying to force something. Now, in the attempt to be empty, to be open to the world, to be in touch with the world, if you try to force it, you won't get anywhere. And yet requires an effort in a very different thing, in a very different sense. Namely, you have to make the effort to get rid of all the disturbing factors which prevent you from being open, from being in touch, or if you please, from seeing, simply seeing or feeling. That is an effort, but it is not forcing. So I would say, in answer to this question, or rather in response to this question, one must differentiate between forcing, efforts in which force is used, and effort in which no force is used. Both are efforts, but the quality of the effort is very different. And please try it out yourself. There's no use in in this to talk more about, because the only way in which words make sense here is if you observe yourself and watch the kind of effort in which you use force and the kind of effort which is an effort yet you have not used force. Another question is here, which says, did you state originally that compensatory aggression was not in the service of life, or that it was not fully in the service of life, or is it not fully in either category? Well, I don't remember what I stated, but what I meant to say was that compensatory aggression, while it is not in the service of life, it is also not in the service of death, but it's rather a result of a failure to be fully alive. It is what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the resentment, that one is alive and yet one knows one is not alive. And in this sense, it is neither in the service of life nor in the service of death, but it is a symptom of failure in living. Here's a question which says, is the hostility displayed in racial integration situations the result of compensatory and narcissistic aggression? Well, I gather the hostility to refer to is meant to be the hostility in the person who fight integration rather than those who promote integration, because it is a remarkable thing, and perhaps one of the most remarkable spiritual phenomena in our world, that the efforts to promote integration in the United States have been efforts without aggression, hostility. I'm not meaning to say that the people who have gone out and have fought for integration were saints, but certainly they were people, it seems, who in the majority were prompted by a deep sense of justice and self-affirmation, and not by a wish to hurt and to attack. If that had been the case, I think all this movement in the South, which is so impressive, would have lost its impressiveness if it had been born out of a sense of destructiveness and rage. But it's a very interesting question. What is the root of that hostility of the people who fight with such fanaticism against integration? Is it, as the writer of this question says, the result of compensatory or of narcissistic aggression? Well, I think it is both. I shall try to explain next time, or maybe I guess in the third lecture really, why it is narcissistic aggression. But it's certainly also compensatory, because actually you will find that hostility and destructiveness, the South is a good example, in this whole racial matter is to be found in those who are most impotent. That is to say, whose life is poor in every sense, materially, culturally, spiritually, and for whom the only assertion of life is the assertion of superiority over other human beings, and that they feel the loss of this superiority as a threat to the one thing which makes them feel that they are men or even human beings. That's paradoxically about it, that one affirms oneself to be a human being by actions which are in contrast to one's own humanity. Here is a question which says, many things in life are impossible to achieve, even if not impotent. Isn't this frustration? Isn't it a matter of semantics? Well, I don't think it's a matter of semantics, because what matters is really not, or let me say, of course it's perfectly true, many things in life are impossible to achieve. This is our human destiny, that in fact most things we would want to achieve, we cannot achieve, both about our own lives, about the world around us. But what matters is really not here, and I can only say the same thing I said in the lecture about frustration, that we want something and it doesn't happen. This is not so bad. The problem is really, and that is what creates aggression, our own sense of our impotence, our emptiness. of our passivity, or whatever word you want to use. And we become hostile not because we don't achieve something. In children can become very furious if they want something and don't get it. Now, many adults, of course, act like that. But they act like that not because they don't get it, they don't achieve it, but because they sense they don't know how to achieve anything. Here is a question which says, some psychologists seem to endorse as healthy a sort of spontaneous aggression which does not seem to be included in your 5 categories. Yes, I guess that's true. Well, of course, you know, there is an older category which is still used a good deal, which says it is a healthy thing that people act out their aggression. Well, from that standpoint, really, the most disagreeable people in the world ought to be the healthiest ones, because they act it out all the time. This is sometimes said in more technical terms and scientific terms. Actually, of course, if somebody represses aggression all the time, I think it is useful for him to be aware of it, because as long as he's not aware of it, he may have symptoms, and he cannot proceed any further in his life because he's constantly busy repressing his aggression. But but being aware of his aggression is not the same thing as acting it out. Nothing is gained by acting it out. I remember a story, I think that was years ago in New Yorker, where a young man comes to one of the most elegant restaurants in London, sits down, the head waiter brings the menu, he reads it for 5 minutes and then leaves and says, "I'm sorry, there's nothing here which pleases me." Well, a few weeks later, he came back and the head waiter asked politely, "May I ask, sir, what was the reason that you couldn't find anything?" And the young man said, "Well, you know, my analyst told me to assert myself." Well, that is not precisely aggression, also it's near to it. I think nothing much is gained by acting out aggression. Aggression is combated not by acting it out, but by a change in attitude to life. And that is mainly, I think, by being more interested in life and by trying to overcome one's sense of impotence. Another question here is, can self-aggression be more damaging than released aggression? I don't quite see here the contradiction. Self-aggression, the opposite side would be aggression against others and not released aggression, because released aggression, the opposite would be repressed aggression. So I'm sorry, I do not fully understand this and therefore find it difficult to answer it. Now, this is a question which says, compensatory aggression is very common. Do you feel that it's unreasonable that it should not be a substitute for impotence? What would you say about the rationality of compensatory aggression? What about a balance of such aggression between individuals? Well, if you can't help it, you just can't. If you feel impotent and get furious, you have to get furious. But it's another question whether it's helpful to you or helpful to anybody else. And to speculate, I think, whether it makes sense or is reasonable doesn't get us anywhere. These are just facts of life, that people who feel impotent easily tend to use force, provided they are not frightened enough to use force, or they don't have what it takes to use force. But this is reasonable only in one sense, namely in the sense that it's reasonable that something falls because of the law of gravity when I drop it. There are many things which are reasonable, which are simply consequences of the nature of things. But they are not reasonable in another sense, that they make sense, are useful, or lead anywhere. This is a question, in view of your remark that there are no saints here, could it be possible that you're still in individuals or nations to ever change? Well, I think that the average man would really not want to kill anybody without being a saint. He may be, what I meant by a saint, kind of facetiously, was a person, and not exactly facetiously either. It's true enough that there is not a trace of hostility, not a trace of the temptation to use violence when he does not succeed in achieving something by his proper powers. Well, such people you might call saintly. But between that and one who wants to kill, or one who, whenever he fails in something, flares up in wild anger and rage, is still a great difference. I think this world would be a very good world if we had only very few saints, but a majority of sane people. That is to say, a majority of people who do not constantly dwell in impotence and react by all sorts of hates and rages in order to cover up their impotence, and in that way make themselves to feel strong. Well, I'm sorry, it's time to stop. There are many more questions, but maybe the one or the other problem which will be taken up next time. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.